In June 1967, Syrian soldiers on the Golan Heights opened fire on Israeli farms below, using tanks designed by Nazi Germany. Panzer IVs, built for Hitler's army, now flying Syrian flags and fitted with Soviet machine guns, were still killing people more than 20 years after the Third Reich collapsed. But the story of how Nazi tanks ended up in an Arab-Israeli war is just one chapter of what might be the strangest afterlife of any weapon in modern history. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, thousands of tanks sat abandoned across Europe, on roads, in forests, around half-destroyed factories. Most people assume they rusted away or got melted for scrap. The reality is far stranger. Some were studied, some were sold, and some fought again in wars the Nazis never imagined, for countries the Nazis despised. What happened to these machines isn't a story about scrapyards. It's a story about how the weapons of one war became the weapons of the next. 1945. The German army has ceased to exist as a fighting force, and with it, the Panzer, the armoured fist that once punched through France in 6 weeks and drove deep into the Soviet Union. Now, the machines that made it possible are scattered across a continent in ruins. Panthers sit half buried in roadside ditches with empty fuel tanks, their camouflage paint blistered and peeling under spring rain. Tigers straddle the edges of forests where their crews walked away for the last time, hatches left hanging open. Panzer IVs lie nose down in cratered fields. Tracks thrown, engines cold, gun barrels pointing uselessly at the sky. Some had been sabotaged by their own operators, turrets blown off with internal charges, engines wrecked with thermite grenades, gun barrels stuffed with dirt and debris. German tankers understood what capture meant, and many chose to destroy their vehicles rather than hand them over intact. Others simply ran out of fuel in the war's final chaotic weeks and left their machines where they stopped, climbing out and joining the long columns of men walking toward surrender. But the Allies weren't just stepping over this wreckage, they were racing each other to get to it first. American, British and Soviet intelligence teams had been tracking German armoured development throughout the war, and now every abandoned Panther, every intact Tiger, every Panzer IV with its optics still in place represented something more valuable than scrap metal. What looked like a junkyard was actually an intelligence goldmine, and the competition to crack it open had already begun. Each Allied power had its own painful history with German tanks, and each wanted answers. American armoured units had fought Tigers in North Africa, Italy and France, always with respect, and often with devastating losses. British tank crews had learned to fear the long 88mm gun that could destroy their Cromwells and Churchills, at ranges where they couldn't effectively shoot back. Soviet armies had faced more German heavy armour than anyone, grinding through Kursk, the Vistula, and the streets of Berlin against machines that outgunned them at every turn. Now they had the chance to understand why. Technical teams from the United States fanned out across Germany and Austria, locating intact examples and shipping them to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. There, engineers fired American 75mm, 76mm and 90mm rounds at captured hulls, carefully documenting which shells could defeat the armour and at what range. The results confirmed what Sherman crews already knew from bitter experience. The standard 75mm gun on most Shermans could not reliably penetrate a Tiger's frontal plate, even at close range. The 76mm performed better, but still struggled. Only the 90mm gun on the late-war M26 Pershing could confidently engage a Tiger head-on. British engineers at Chertsey and Lulworth went further, disassembling entire drivetrains, transmissions and suspension systems. They documented the sophisticated interleaved roadwheel system that gave German heavy tanks a remarkably smooth ride, but which also trapped mud and ice in winter conditions. They praised the optical quality of German gun sights, precision instruments that helped explain the terrifying accuracy of the 88. Soviet trophy brigades were the most methodical of all. Intact examples were shipped to testing grounds near Kubinka outside Moscow, where engineers fired captured German guns at Tigers to map every vulnerability. Stalin himself took a personal interest in what these machines could teach Soviet designers, pushing lessons directly into the development of the IS-3 and T-10 heavy tanks. But here was the paradox that defined this entire period. The Allies needed these tanks destroyed. Every one was a symbol of German military power, and occupation policy demanded rapid demilitarization. Yet they also needed them intact long enough to reverse engineer. The same vehicles marked for elimination were also blueprints for the next generation of Allied armour. That tension would shape everything that followed. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit subscribe. This channel covers the hidden aftermath stories that never made it into the textbooks. The tension between study and destruction couldn't last. By late 1945, the Allied Control Council issued clear directives. Germany could retain no armoured fighting vehicles of any kind. The handful of tanks preserved for testing represented a tiny fraction of the thousands that had survived the war. The rest were marked for elimination. Across occupied Germany, massive collection sites sprang up at former military bases and training grounds. Rows of turrets and hulls with scorched paint and shell holes sat stacked in muddy lots, almost like cars in a modern junkyard waiting for cutting. Torches. At Bergen-Hohn in northern Germany, British forces assembled entire fields of captured armour, Panthers alongside self-propelled guns and half-tracks, their weapons disabled, fluids drained, engines cold. Some were demolished with explosives, turrets blown clean off the hull ring. Others were simply dragged into position and cut apart with acetylene torches by work crews who laboured through rain and frost. But this wasn't just about security. Post-war Europe was starving for steel. Bridges needed rebuilding. Railway lines had been bombed into twisted ribbons. Factories that might produce civilian goods sat roofless and gutted. The thousands of tons of high-grade metal locked inside abandoned Panzers represented something Europe desperately needed: raw material for reconstruction. Scrapping a single Panther recovered roughly 45 tons of steel. Multiply that across hundreds of vehicles, and the numbers added up fast. For communities recovering from 6 years of total war, the arrival of scrap dealers to dismantle nearby wrecks provided both employment and income during desperate times. Men who had spent the war hiding from these machines now climbed on top of them with cutting torches, slicing through armour plate that had once seemed invincible. Women and children hauled away smaller components, road wheels, track links, hatch covers, feeding them into local foundries that melted the steel of the Wehrmacht into the raw material of peacetime. Within 2 years of the war ending, most of Germany's abandoned armour had been cut apart, melted down, and reborn as girders, pipes, and rails. The machines built to conquer Europe were now literally rebuilding it, but not all of them went to the smelters. And that's where this story takes its first unexpected turn. France had been humiliated by German armour in 1940. The panzer divisions that rolled through the Ardennes and down the Champs-Élysées had shattered French military pride in a matter of weeks. So what France did next seems almost unthinkable. It assembled roughly 50 captured Panthers into a fully operational armoured regiment and put them into frontline service under the French flag. The 500 Third Regiment de Chars de Combat operated Nazi-designed tanks as official French military equipment from 1944 through 1947. French crews trained on the same machines that had once occupied their country, learning the Panther's complex transmission, its powerful 75mm high-velocity gun, and the sophisticated optical systems that made it one of the most dangerous tanks of the war. Some of these crews had fought against Panthers just months earlier. Now they sat in the same driver's seats, gripped the same control sticks, and peered through the same gun sights that had once been aimed at them. French engineers didn't just operate these vehicles, they studied them intensely, producing a formal technical evaluation known as Light Panther 1947 that documented everything from armour composition to engine performance. The goal was clear: use the captured machines as a stepping stone to rebuild France's own tank industry from the ground up. There was an undeniable irony to the sight of Panthers rolling through French army exercises with tricolour markings painted over faded German camouflage. The same vehicles that had crushed French resistance were now defending French sovereignty. But France eventually hit the same wall the Germans had faced during the war. Panthers were mechanically temperamental and a nightmare to maintain without access to original German supply chains. Spare parts were scarce, engines overheated, and transmissions failed with frustrating regularity. By the late 1940s, France retired its Panthers in favour of domestically designed replacements. The surplus had to go somewhere, and in the shadowy world of post-war arms dealing, there were always buyers. During the 1950s and 1960s, surplus German tanks entered an international arms market that operated with minimal oversight and even less public attention. Countries like France, Czechoslovakia, and Spain found themselves sitting on stockpiles of refurbished Panzer IVs and related vehicles. Machines that were obsolete by Western standards, but still perfectly functional for nations rebuilding their militaries on tight budgets. Dealers brokered quiet sales. Vehicles were overhauled in European workshops, repainted, and shipped by rail and freighter to buyers across the Middle East. Over 100 Panzer IVs were sold to one customer in particular, and the destination would have been unthinkable to the men who originally crewed them. At least 17 ex-Spanish Panzer IVs arrived in confirmed good working condition, alongside dozens more from French and Czechoslovak stockpiles. The buyer was Syria. And this is where the story of Nazi Germany's abandoned tanks becomes something no one could have predicted. Syria received those 100-plus refurbished Panzer IVs throughout the 1950s. Tanks designed by the Third Reich, now wearing Syrian military markings and sometimes retrofitted with Soviet-pattern machine guns. They were integrated into Syrian armoured units, trained on by Syrian crews, and deployed to defensive positions along the country's southwestern border. In June 1967, during the Six-Day War, Syrian Panzer IVs sat dug in up to the hull on the Golan Heights, their long 75mm guns pointed down at Israeli kibbutzim and farming communities in the Galilee Valley below. Families in those settlements had built bomb shelters against Arab shelling, never imagining that the shells raining down on them were being fired from guns designed in Essen and Kassel for Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht. Nazi-designed tanks in Arab service, firing at a Jewish state that existed in large part because of the horrors the Nazi regime had inflicted. The documented facts carry an irony so heavy it barely needs stating. These weren't museum pieces pressed into emergency service. They were frontline military assets, maintained and deployed as part of Syria's standing defence. Alongside the Panzer IVs, Syria also operated Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyers, low-profile armoured vehicles originally designed to ambush Allied tanks on the Western Front, now repurposed as static defensive positions overlooking the Jordan Valley. And their story didn't end in 1967. Military inventory records indicate that Panzer IVs and Jagdpanzer IVs were still listed as warehoused assets at the Al-Zabadani army base north of Damascus as late as the early 1990s. Then they quietly vanished from Syrian inventories. Whether they were finally scrapped, buried, sold onward, or simply left to decay in some forgotten depot, no one knows for certain. their ultimate fate remains one of the small, strange mysteries of Cold War-era arms dealing. But Syria and France were the exceptions. For every tank that found a second life, hundreds more met grimmer ends. Across Europe, hulks too damaged or too remote for cost-effective recovery were simply left where they sat, in forests, bogs, riverbeds, and fields that farmers slowly reclaimed around them. Some sank into soft ground over the years, swallowed inch by inch until only a turret ring or gun barrel remained visible above the surface. Others faced a more deliberate destruction. Military forces across Europe dragged abandoned Panzers onto firing ranges and used them as live fire targets for decades. New recruits learning to operate post-war anti-tank weapons practiced on real German steel, punching holes through armour plates that had once stopped everything the Allies could throw at them. Generation after generation of gunnery crews trained on the same hulks, each exercise adding fresh scars to metal that had last moved under its own power in 1945. Over the years, these target hulks were shot to pieces, armour peeled back like tin, turrets caved in, hulls reduced to skeletal frames pitted with impact craters. Contemporary photographs show wrecks sitting in dunes and scrub that are barely recognisable as vehicles, more like abstract sculptures of destruction than the war machines they once were. Some of the saddest surviving wrecks today aren't on battlefields at all. They're on training grounds, where the very armies that once feared these tanks systematically destroyed them round after round, year after year, until almost nothing remained. Meanwhile, over 1.3 million tons of military munitions were dumped into German coastal waters after the war, and alongside them, fragments of the Reich's armoured legacy sank into a different kind of silence. The machines left underwater or buried in mud entered a limbo that continues to this day, occasionally surfacing during construction projects or droughts, like ghosts from a war the landscape hasn't finished digesting. Of the tens of thousands of armoured fighting vehicles Germany produced during the war, only a tiny fraction survive today. They sit in museums at Bovington, Saumur, Kubinka and Fort Benning, carefully restored, roped off and lit with the clinical glow of historical exhibit halls. Visitors press against barriers to photograph them, marvelling at the sheer mass of steel, the thickness of the armour plate, the size of the gun barrels. Children climb onto outdoor displays for pictures, unaware of what these machines were built to do. A few surviving tanks serve as gate guardians outside military bases, weathering quietly in the open air. Others stand as monuments in towns where battles once raged, their gun barrels pointed at nothing, slowly oxidizing in the rain. The mystery of where they all went is answered by everything we've just covered: deliberate scrapping, gunnery practice, arms exports, and simple neglect. Each surviving tank represents not just a machine, but a decision someone made. A decision to melt it, shoot it, sell it, or save it. Museum curators still wrestle with a difficult tension: how to display these vehicles so they teach about war and dictatorship without becoming objects of fascination for the wrong audience. A panther behind glass is a history lesson. A panther on a pedestal can become something else entirely. The story of what happened to Nazi tanks after World War II isn't really about the tanks at all. It's about what the world chose to do with the tools of destruction once the destruction was over. Some were studied and copied, their innovations quietly absorbed into the armour of the Cold War. Some were melted down and reborn as the infrastructure of a recovering continent. Some were sold to the highest bidder and fought in wars their designers never imagined. And some were simply left behind, rusting in fields, sinking into riverbeds, waiting on forgotten ranges for one more round that never came. The weapons changed hands, changed flags, changed purposes, but they kept destroying long after the war that built them had ended. And in a depot north of Damascus, a handful of them may still be waiting, silent, rusting, and unaccounted for. Thanks for watching History Hangover. If you found this video insightful, check out our other deep dives into the hidden aftermath of World War II. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next upload.